A widowed cattle rancher posted an advertisement for a cook, expecting a tough, practical man for the job. Instead, a single mother holding a newborn arrived at his ranch. The sound of a tin plate clattering on the floor was quickly followed by the scraping of chairs and muttered curses. "Damn it, Thorn. Even the coyotes wouldn't eat this stew," growled Wade Kellerman, one of the older ranch hands. His wiry frame hunched over the long table as he pointed at the slop in his bowl with exaggerated disdain. "Tastes like someone boiled a boot with onions." Laughter rippled through the mess hall, though it was hollow, tinged with the exhaustion of long days under the sun and the endless monotony of dust and disappointment. A younger man slammed a dented pot onto the table with a loud clank. "We work 14 hours a day, and this is what we get fed?" he said angrily. In the silence that followed, boots clicked on the wooden floorboards as Thorn McCrae, the ranch owner, stepped into the room. He was broad-shouldered, his skin tanned and weathered by the harsh land he worked. He paused for a moment before speaking in a calm but firm voice. "Anyone thinks they can do better," he said, his gaze sweeping over the men like a cold wind. "The kitchen's open. Go on, impress us." No one moved. He stared them down, then added, "Shut up and eat." With that, he turned and walked out, the door slamming behind him, final and resolute. Outside, the wind carried the sense of dust and cattle dung, and the sky stretched out endlessly in all directions, a blistering blue, cloudless expanse. The same sky he had buried his wife under 2 years ago. In the solitude of his home, more of a fortress than a dwelling, Thorn sat at his desk, the lantern light casting shadows across the room. He stared at the framed photo of his late wife, Clara. Her smile had been the only soft thing in his life, and since her passing, the world had become harder, louder, and unbearably quiet. He opened the drawer and pulled out a sheet of paper, dipping his pen into ink. He began to write, the strokes of his pen blunt and practical. Number 1. Cook, capable of preparing meals for 15 men. Must endure hard work, long hours, and hot kitchens. Room and board provided. Pay negotiable. Apply in person at McCrae Ranch, north of Yellow Horn. He paused, then underlined "in person" for emphasis, figuring no woman would bother responding to such an ad. A week later, dust billowed over the Texas Panhandle, rising from the scorched earth like ghosts of seasons past. The wind shimmered across the prairie when the ranch gate creaked open on its rusted hinges, alerting the ranch dogs to an arrival. Thorn stepped out of the barn, wiping sweat from his brow, when he saw her. A woman, small and slight, her sun-bleached bonnet barely keeping the wind from her face. She carried a bundled infant against her chest, wrapped in worn linen. Her dress was travel-stained, and her boots cracked with age. Her eyes, steady and green like fresh grass, met his without hesitation. "I saw your notice," she said before he could speak. "I can cook. I need a place to stay." Thorn blinked, surprised. "You walked here." "I came by wagon," she replied. "But I had to leave it at the fork when the wheel gave out. It's just me and him now." She glanced down at the baby in her arms. "Juniper Rose," she added softly. Thorn studied her for a long moment, jaw clenched. "I wasn't expecting a woman," he said finally. "But food's still food, and mouths don't care who made it." The men, who had gathered in small groups behind him, whispered among themselves. One chuckled low, another muttered, "A babe and a babe," but Juniper didn't flinch. "I do not ask for wages, not yet. Just shelter, food, and a place for my son to sleep." He could have said no. He probably should have. But something about her steady gaze, the quiet resolve in her, stilled him. "You cook," he said, his voice rough. "Tonight. If the men don't riot, you stay." She nodded, her expression calm. "That's fair." As she stepped through the threshold of McCrae Ranch, the child nestled against her chest let out a soft sigh, the sound of sleep. It was a small, almost imperceptible sound, but it felt like something shifting in the air, like life returning to a place that had long been barren. The kitchen at McCrae Ranch was more of a shack than a proper building. A lean-to beside the main house with a smoke-blackened hearth and uneven beams. Shelves were bare, as empty as a winter field. But Juniper stepped into it with quiet determination, the baby still cradled against her chest. She settled the child into a wooden crate lined with folded flour sacks. The baby gurgled once before drifting off to sleep, unfazed by the clatter of pots or the dry rasp of kindling being split. Juniper moved efficiently, speaking only when spoken to. She found old flour and canned beans sealed with wax. From these humble ingredients, she managed to create something warm and comforting. By sundown, the men had gathered in loose groups, their arms crossed, their heads tilted in suspicion. Most of them expected disaster. Instead, they were met with cornbread thick with molasses, beans that had a smoky, spicy flavor, and thin slices of salted pork that were crisped to perfection. Eli, a burly red-faced cowhand, took a bite and paused mid-chew. "What the hell is this?" he barked. Juniper looked up from where she was ladling stew into bowls, unfazed. Eli scoffed but kept eating, his voice a bit softer. "Tastes like I paid 5 cents for it in El Paso," he muttered. Then, without another word, he cleaned his plate to the last crumb. Thorne stood silently by the mess hall, arms crossed, leaning against the door frame. Since Juniper had entered the kitchen, he hadn't said a word or offered any assistance, but his gaze never left her. He observed her every move. How she tied her hair back with a frayed piece of ribbon, how she shifted the baby's crate closer to the stove to keep him warm, and how she stirred a pot with one hand while gently rocking her son with the other. She never raised her voice, never asked for help, and never let the exhaustion show on her face. Later that night, when the moon was high in the cold, clear sky and the men had long gone to bed, Thorne stepped outside to check the paddock. He noticed a faint glow coming from the kitchen window. As he moved closer, he peered through the warped glass and saw Juniper, barefoot, kneeling by the hearth, coaxing a flame from the dying embers. Her baby was peacefully asleep, wrapped up and resting on a pile of grain sacks nearby. Despite the freezing air outside, Juniper moved slowly and carefully, tucking her skirt beneath her knees as she added more wood to the fire. The flames flared up, casting an orange glow across her face. Then, Thorne saw something that made him freeze. Juniper pulled a tin from her satchel, a small, dented container wrapped in cloth. She opened it, took a few dried mint leaves, and dropped them into a kettle of water. A moment later, the smell of peppermint wafted through the air. She poured the tea into a clay bowl, placed it on a tray, and turned to the door. Thorne instinctively stepped back just as she opened it. Their eyes met. "You've been coughing," she said softly. "Dry air, cold wind. I thought it couldn't hurt." She held out the tray to him. He didn't take it immediately. Instead, he simply stared at her. This determined, quiet woman with a child and a fire burning in her eyes. After a long moment, he nodded, sharp and decisive. Then she placed the tray by the door and disappeared inside. Only then did he pick it up. The tea was warm, bitter, and soothing. He drank it all. The next morning, when Juniper entered the kitchen, she found the bowl washed and neatly placed on the counter. She smiled, though just barely, and continued her work. The fire had caught, and the Texas wind swept dust across the ranch. Thorne McCrae stepped out of the barn and caught sight of something unusual behind the cattle pens. Narrowing his eyes, he saw 3 small patches of green in an area where nothing usually grew, just scrub and old dung. He walked closer, crouching beside the plants. They weren't weeds but something deliberately cultivated. He recognized the mint, faintly aromatic even in the heat, and also saw daisies, tough and wild. There was another leaf he didn't recognize, broad and dark-veined, like it belonged in the mountains rather than here. A small wooden marker stood beside the plants, with delicate script reading "Bones Set." Thorne straightened and turned just as Juniper came into view, carrying a basket with her baby Sonny wrapped against her chest. She didn't flinch when she saw him. She paused, one brow raised. "They don't take up much room," she said. "I didn't say a word," Thorne replied. "You didn't have to," she answered as she walked past him. the basket swinging in her hand, her bare feet making no sound against the dirt. Later that week, as dusk settled in, a boy of about 13 stumbled across the yard. Caleb, one of the newer hands, had tried to prove himself but was too inexperienced to know what was safe to chew on while mending a fence. He collapsed near the water trough, pale as death, vomiting into the dirt. The men panicked, and Thorn barked for someone to fetch the doctor from Yellow Horn, at least 2 hours away on a fast horse. But Juniper arrived almost immediately, still covered in flowers with Sunny slung across her back in a shawl. She knelt beside the boy, checked his pulse, then leaned in close to smell his breath. "Cattle sage," she muttered. She whispered, "He's eaten, but is he going to survive?" One of the men asked, his voice breaking. "Not if I don't act quickly," she replied without hesitation. She handed the baby over to Thorn, who accepted the child instinctively, still stunned. Without asking any more questions, she dashed back to the kitchen. Moments later, she returned holding a jar of a yellowish root, a small cloth pouch, and a teacup. She boiled water on the stove, the sun sinking low and casting a golden glow as steam rose like silent prayers. She mashed the root with a spoon, added some mint, and carefully dripped the mixture into Caleb's mouth, drop by trembling drop. The men stood in silence, some removing their hats, others crossing themselves, while one quietly muttered a prayer. After 30 minutes, Caleb's breathing began to steady. By morning, he was able to sit up and sip some broth. Word spread quickly, and by lunch, the men no longer referred to her as just the cook. She was now Miss Juniper. One even tipped his hat and called her ma'am, as though she had always belonged to a higher station. Later that evening, Thorn stood by the porch, watching her sort herbs into small muslin bags. Her baby cooed softly in a cradle nearby. The horizon was drenched in gold, and the sound of cattle lowing echoed in the distance. He approached and leaned against the rail next to her. "You know what you're doing," he said. She nodded but didn't look up. "I wouldn't still be here if I didn't," she replied. "You study medicine?" Juniper shook her head. "I studied survival." Thorn glanced at her, then said, "That boy would have died without you." She was quiet for a moment, her thoughts drifting. "My grandmother was Cherokee," she said softly. "She lived by the river past Arkansas Bend. She taught me about what heals and what harms. She said, 'The land gives both. You just have to know where to look.'" Thorn ran a hand along the porch post, deep in thought. "You always travel with a baby?" he asked. Juniper smiled faintly, the exhaustion evident in her expression. But there was warmth in it too. "Only since he came. His name's Sunny. He arrived in the middle of a thunderstorm, screaming louder than the wind." "Are you running from someone?" Thorn asked, his voice more curious than intrusive. Juniper's eyes hardened slightly. "Not anymore. Just looking for a place I don't have to run from." Thorn didn't press further. He simply stood with her, their silence blending with the cool evening air. The dusk wrapped around them like a soft blanket, the rustling of the herbs in their pouches the only sound other than the hum of night insects. For the first time in a long while, Thorn McCrae didn't feel the need to fill the silence with words. He just listened. Things changed slowly, almost imperceptibly, like the gradual shift of seasons when no one is watching. The men at McCrae Ranch began to change their habits. No longer did they slam doors. Now they took a moment to wipe their boots before entering the cookhouse. They removed their hats whenever the baby was near. Someone even fixed the loose porch board without anyone asking. And every evening, without fail, there was always fresh cornbread on the long table, sliced and buttered with care, alongside a pot of herbal tea that eased the grit of the day from their throats. Thorn watched it all happen in silence. He noticed how Juniper moved through the house, never claiming any space as her own, but somehow fitting there like she had always belonged. He saw how she always left a cup of tea outside his door when his cough returned during the colder nights. Her rare laughter, real and genuine, was like water flowing over smooth rocks whenever one of the men said something foolish during dinner. Gradually, Thorn began waking earlier. It wasn't because he had to, but because he wanted to be up before the sun and work on the old kitchen shed. The door, which had hung crooked for years, now swung evenly. The cracked window frame that had been left broken for so long now had fresh glass. He rebuilt the worn-out step with care, sanding the edges so that she wouldn't trip while holding the baby. He never mentioned the work, but with every nail he drove into place, every hinge he oiled, it was his unspoken apology and thanks. One night, the wind howled louder than usual, sharp and dry, like it carried knives. Juniper couldn't sleep. Sunny stirred restlessly, then settled again into peaceful slumber. She lay there, listening to the storm outside, her thoughts drifting like the wind, but for once, she felt a sense of calm. She wrapped herself in a shawl and moved through the house silently, past the creaking wooden floorboards, until she reached the barn. There, in the dim glow of a single oil lamp, sat Thorn. He was alone, his legs stretched out before him, an old guitar resting across his knees. The instrument looked worn and weathered, like a piece of driftwood. Its strings were dull, the body covered in dust, the tuning pegs loose. Yet, his fingers moved over it as though reconnecting with an old lover. He didn't notice her at first. His head was down, his fingers picking a hesitant tune that faltered before slowly finding its rhythm. Something half-remembered, a tune tinged with longing. Juniper stepped closer, careful not to startle him. When he looked up, surprised, she didn't say a word. Instead, she walked over and sat on a low crate next to him. Her shawl shifted slightly, exposing the curve of her neck and collarbone. In the soft light, she gazed at the guitar. "I haven't heard one of these in a long time," she spoke softly. Thorn swallowed, his voice tight. "Used to play every night when Clara was still around," he said. "Music made this place feel like a home, not a prison." He chuckled bitterly and stopped playing. "Stopped touching it the day we buried her." Juniper's eyes softened. She reached out, her fingers brushing the guitar strings. "You know," she said quietly, "it's not the sin, it's living without it." He searched her face, looking for mockery or pity, but found neither, just understanding. Outside, the wind howled past the eaves, kicking dust across the yard. But inside the barn, everything was still. He strummed the guitar once, and the note lingered. Juniper leaned her head against the wall behind them, closing her eyes. Thorn didn't say anything more. He simply played. And as the notes drifted in the air, something long buried inside him began to stir. It started small, like a whisper. Patches of brittle grass turning gray, then yellow, curling into ash beneath an unrelenting heat. Within days, the western pastures seemed scorched, even though no fire had touched them. Then came the sickness. The herd grew sluggish. Eyes lost their shine, and movements slowed. Some of the cows limped, others refused to eat. One morning, a steer collapsed at the watering hole, foam crusting its mouth. Thorn ordered it shot and buried, hoping it was just an isolated incident. But it wasn't. By the end of the week, 6 more were dead, 30 sick, and the once green grass now looked like funeral shrouds spread across the land. Thorn stood in the corral at dusk, his hat in his hands, dust on his skin, staring at the horizon as if it might offer him an answer. But it didn't. The doctor from Yellow Horn came, examined the cattle, shrugged, and offered little more than a prescription for calming the symptoms. "This land is cursed," one of the cowhands muttered. Thorn didn't reply, his jaw clenched so tightly it could have cracked. That night, Juniper didn't come to dinner. Instead, she crouched by the fence, running her fingers through the manure of a cow, studying its texture and color. She called Thorn over quietly. "This isn't natural sickness," she said. "It's what they ate." "Poisoned?" he asked, his voice strained. "Not exactly. There's a plant spurge. It looks like milkweed when it sprouts. Cattle will eat it when the real grass dies off." She lifted the cow's lip, revealing ulcers like rotting flesh inside its mouth. She stood. "I've seen this before. My grandmother treated a herd up in Cherokee land when I was 10. Thorn didn't ask more questions. He simply nodded. She disappeared into the woods with a basket and a knife. For 2 days, Juniper worked from dawn until well after dark, boiling bark into a thick pulp, grinding dried papaya leaves into powder, and mixing ash from mesquite logs into a sticky paste. As she worked, she hummed a half-lullaby, half-memory. Baby Sunny slept nearby, wrapped snugly in a feed sack turned into a cradle. Then, one by one, she fed the remedy to the sick cattle, forcing the thick paste between their teeth, massaging their throats to make them swallow. Some resisted, others spat it out, some even vomited, but surprisingly many stood up the next day, their legs steadier. By the end of the week, while reports of entire herds dying in neighboring counties came in, only a handful of Thorne's cattle had died, and about 80% survived. The pasture remained lifeless and dry, and the wind still howled, but inside the barn, the cattle breathed easier. Juniper finished her rounds and collapsed onto the hay, her arms covered in ash, her bodice soaked with sweat. Thorne stood in the doorway watching her. She looked up at him. "It's not luck," she whispered. "It's knowledge." He didn't say anything. He didn't ask why she had risked her health and strength. Instead, he stepped forward and, for the first time since Clara's funeral, wrapped his arms around another person. It wasn't romantic, nor was it cautious. It was the kind of embrace a man gives when he realizes that the world still has things worth holding on to. Juniper didn't speak. She didn't need to. She closed her eyes and let herself be held. By mid-August, the rain still hadn't come, but something else began to grow. Juniper, once only known as the cook, was now called on whenever someone twisted an ankle, came down with a fever, or burned their hand on the forge. She never turned anyone away. Her hands were steady, her voice calm. She taught simple remedies using the herbs she knew so well. She had become skilled at using the land's natural remedies: mint for nausea, yarrow for cuts, and willow bark for headaches. Soon, the local men began seeking her guidance: how to crush leaves, how long to boil a root, and which teas helped with sleep. She taught them not as students but as equals, as brothers learning the way of survival on the land. Rumors spread about a place to the north where a woman could heal the sick and where even cattle seemed to thrive after near-death experiences. They spoke of McCrae Ranch, where the babies were always smiling, and the food never tasted like gunpowder. Soon, drifters began showing up, dusty, gaunt, searching for work, water, or a place to rest. Juniper never turned anyone away if she trusted them. If she didn't, they were gone by sundown. One day, a traveler arrived walking on foot. His silver beard, limp hat, and patchwork coat spoke of years of struggle. He didn't stay long, just enough time to drink and rest under the old elm tree by the well. As Juniper walked by, her baby Sunny on her hip, softly singing as she picked mint, the old man spoke. "You ain't just feeding mouths, miss." His voice cracked like a dry creek bed. "You're feeding souls." She looked at him, surprised. "That boy lived long," he added, pointing to the baby, "because he believed he could heal the world around you." With a tip of his hat, he walked on. That evening, as the sun dipped low behind the ridges, Thorne sat on the porch with a mug of Juniper's tea, holding it with both hands, feeling its warmth. He didn't speak when she joined him, for the silence between them had become something shared, not empty. The next morning, Juniper woke to the sound of hammering. At first, she thought it was repairs, perhaps someone mending a fence or fixing a shutter. But when she stepped outside barefoot, squinting against the bright morning sun, she saw Thorne working beside the kitchen wall. His sleeves were rolled up, sweat and sawdust marking his arms. He was measuring pine wood for something. Sunny was on a blanket nearby, happily gurgling at the birds. Juniper watched for a moment before speaking. "You lost another window?" she asked. "No," he replied without looking up. "Storm damage?" she asked again. "Nope." She waited, but Thorne continued to drive nails into the wood, wiping his brow and standing back to admire his work. "It's for you," he finally said, his voice steady. "A room, separate entrance, next to the kitchen. Bigger than the corner you sleep in." Her breath caught. "You didn't have to," she whispered. "I know," he replied, "but I'm asking you to plant things that'll need summer to grow." A soft, radiant smile spread across her face. She didn't stop him when he reached for her hand. To everyone else on that vast Texas land, it might have meant nothing, but between them, amidst the nails, planks, and rising walls, it was louder than any wedding vow. A few weeks later, a group of men arrived in a fine-covered wagon. Their clothes were clean, their boots polished, and they had a businesslike air about them. Thorn met them at the gate. "We've heard your ranch has something special," the man in front said, tipping his hat. "More than cattle." Thorn crossed his arms. "We sell beef, not stories," he replied. The man chuckled, unfazed. "Heard you've got a lady here, a healer, knows how to mix herbs, calm a man's nerves. Is that right?" Thorn's face went still. "You here to buy cows or not?" he asked, his voice cold. The man moved closer. "We own a fine establishment in Amarillo. We could use someone like her. Pay well. Room and board. She won't be mistreated. In fact, some of our clientele are quite influential." Thorn nodded once, then punched the man square in the jaw. He hit the ground with a thud like a sack of feed. The others reached for their weapons, but Thorn already had his rifle up, steady in his hands. "Get off my land," he growled. "Before I forget, I'm a peaceful man." The men left, but they didn't forget. 3 nights later, as the ranch lay quiet under a silver moon, Juniper awoke to an eerie silence. Too much silence. Then came the creak of a floorboard. Her heart raced as she sat up, the cradle beside her empty. The window was wide open. She screamed. Thorn was out of bed in under a minute. They were on horseback in seconds, lanterns swinging from their saddles. Juniper, clutching her herb pouch, her heart burning with rage and terror, rode beside him. They followed the trail through the dense thicket, hooves crunching the earth, branches breaking beneath them. Thorn tracked like a wolf, certain of the path. They found them by the creek bend, the same men huddled around a fire, laughing darkly. One of them held Sonny, wrapped in his jacket. "Give him back," Juniper shouted, her voice sharp and dangerous. The leader sneered. "Should have come with us, sweetheart. Now you'll come anyway, without your pride." Thorn fired once, the bullet kicking up dirt. "Let the boy go," he ordered, voice low. The man lunged, dragging Sonny toward the fire. Juniper reacted without hesitation. She grabbed a handful of powder, burnt bark, and dried leaf ash from her pouch and threw it straight into his eyes. He screamed, stumbling blindly, clutching his face. Juniper didn't wait. She grabbed Sonny and ran for Thorn. Thorn pulled her close, holding her tightly as she clutched the baby to her chest, tears falling freely. She whispered his name repeatedly, rocking back and forth as the men disappeared into the night, the danger now gone. Thorn said nothing, simply walking over and kneeling beside them. He pressed a long, quiet kiss to Sonny's forehead before gently placing the baby back in Juniper's trembling arms. He remained seated beside her until the first light of dawn broke the dark. As evening began to settle over the Texas Panhandle, golden hues spread across the dry, grassy fields. The great oak tree behind the house, older than the land itself, stood silently, its branches creaking in the wind like an old voice remembering forgotten tunes. Thorn McCrae sat beneath its weathered bark, his guitar cradled in his lap. He hadn't played in weeks. Not since that night in the barn when Juniper reminded him that music was a prayer. His fingers moved slowly, gently picking the strings, playing Clara's melody. A song that never had words but always carried meaning. The soft notes drifted through the yard, floating like smoke through the open kitchen windows, where Juniper was peeling apples. She stepped barefoot onto the porch, moving quietly as dusk began to settle. She watched him in silence as he played, only speaking after he finished the song with a sigh. "I used to think that song was for the past," he said softly. "But it's not anymore." Juniper walked down toward him, her shawl fluttering in the evening breeze. Her hands were stained with cinnamon and flour. She sat across from him in the dry grass, looking at him with quiet understanding. "I thought I'd never hear you play again," she whispered. Thorn shrugged, a soft laugh escaping him. "I thought I'd never want to," he replied, setting the guitar aside. They both sat in the comfortable silence, the air warm around them. "Juniper," he said slowly, "I ain't asking you to stay, 'cause I think I need someone around the house. Lord knows, you ain't just someone here." She raised an eyebrow at him, but he continued, "I'm asking because I've known two kinds of silence. One kills, the other heals. And ever since you walked in here with that baby and tea, it's been the healing kind." Juniper's eyes glistened as she looked at him. "I'm not good with words," he continued, his voice soft. "I ain't got no ring, but I don't want another sunrise without knowing you're close enough to touch." She laughed quietly, her tears trembling as she spoke. "I came here begging for food, begging just to stay. Now you're asking me to stay forever." Thorn leaned forward, resting his forehead against hers. "I'm asking you to be my home," he whispered. She cupped his face, her voice breaking. "There really is spring after the coldest March," she said softly. They married 3 days later. There were no preachers, no bells, no lace, no choir. Only the oak tree standing tall as if to bless the moment. Lanterns hung between fence posts, and Eli roasted a hog while Caleb, now fully recovered, played the harmonica with his unique, unpredictable flair. But no one minded the clumsy tunes. Sonny, still a baby, wore a crown of wildflowers, giggling through the ceremony. Juniper, wearing a mint-green cloak and her hair braided with ribbon, walked barefoot between hay bales. When she reached Thorn, she smiled and said, "Took you long enough, cowboy." Thorn smiled back, like a man reborn. They exchanged vows with no paper, no ink, just their promises and the shared knowledge that it was real. In the days that followed, Thorn carved a new sign for the front gate. He smoothed it with his hands, burning the letters into the wood and hanging it beneath the old ranch name, Cray and Rose Ranch of Hope. It wasn't just a place anymore. It was a sanctuary for the weary and a home for the broken-hearted. The sun set low on the horizon as Thorn finished, the letters glowing softly in the fading light. Inside the house, Juniper rocked Sonny, who was now taking his first proud, wobbly steps, his chubby hands clutching anything within reach. His babbling filled the house with the sounds of a life brimming with promise. Thorn walked inside, wiping his hands on his jeans. He crossed to where Juniper stood, and they watched the boy together. He took her hand, their fingers intertwining. "Spring came late, but it came," he whispered. "The wind's soft now, sweeping across the yard, through the blooming herbs, and over the fields healing from the winter. And under the oak tree, where a guitar once sang for ghosts, there's only silence, the good kind." As the night settled in, the house felt alive with the warmth of new beginnings and the steady rhythm of healing hearts. And if this story touched you, if you felt the dust, the hunger, the slow blossoming hope between two souls, then you belong with us here at Wild West Love Stories. We share tales not just of love, but of resilience, of women who carried healing in their hands, of men who learned to kneel not in defeat but in devotion, and of love that grows in hard seasons, nurtured by perseverance. So, if you're ready for more dusty porches, whispered vows, firelight kisses, and redemptive rides into the unknown, subscribe now to Wild West Love Stories, where every love leaves a trail, and every trail leads to the start